Hi, my name's Anne from Orchid Systems, and in this webinar, I'm going to be running through training for how to set up Information Manager Notes. But first of all, how to know if Notes is a product for you or for your customers. Do your staff regularly refer to information outside Sage 300, such as post-it notes and other documentation, to help them with their tasks? Are your efforts to increase collaboration being stifled by having key information held in ways that don't facilitate sharing of knowledge? Would you like to have relevant and contextual alerts, procedural instructions, or other information presented when and where it's needed, flexible enough to include images and hyperlinks, and all stored and managed within Sage 300? If the answer is yes to any of these questions, then Notes might be a product for you. Information Manager Notes provides context-sensitive notes on any Sage 300 screen and associated data. This covers all the core Sage 300 modules, for example, Common Services, Admin Services, GL, AR, AP, Order Entry, Inventory Control, Purchase Orders, Project and Job Costing, and the US or Canadian payroll. But you can also attach context-sensitive notes to any third party who develops their screens through the SDK. For example, all of Orchid's modules, EFT, RMA, inter-entity transactions, etc. You can attach notes at the master file level, for example, customers, vendors, items, general ledger accounts, sales reps, locations, categories. And you can attach notes at combinations of two master files, for example, a specific note that is specific to a particular customer and a particular item, or a particular vendor and a particular item, any two master files. You can also attach notes to transactions, for example, GL journal entries, orders, shipments, invoices, receipts. And you can also attach notes to a combination of a master file and a transaction number, for example, a vendor and the vendor's invoice, or a customer and the customer's receipt or purchase order. You can also use notes to attach procedures to a screen. You can attach procedures to any of the core Sage 300 modules, Common Services, Admin Services, GL, AR, AP, OE, IC, PO, PJC, Canadian payroll or US payroll, and you can also attach procedural notes to any third party developing the screens through the SDK, for example, Orchid's RMA, EFT, inter-entity transactions, etc. The training topics that I'm going to cover today is activating Information Manager Notes, where you activate it in Admin Services and then use the Activate icon. And then we're going to run through the Notes license, those screens that are available if you're using Information Manager Notes, and those Information Manager screens which are not available if you only have a Notes license. So with the Notes license, you are able to run note types, roles, user roles. In the options, you can access the Notes and Document Link Hotkey tab and the Notes Categories tab. And in the Information Manager transactions, you can run Notes and Notes user options. And we're going to go through the steps on how to configure Notes, and we're going to use the Notes visual process flow. And that walks you through in the right order, the note types, roles, user roles, using options to define your Notes and Document Link Hotkey tab and Notes Categories tab, how to refresh the tray icon, how to start the tray icon, and in transactions, how to use the Notes and Notes user options. And we're going to run through these options first by creating item notes. So these are master file notes, and we're going to create item notes to display in the alert box. And we're going to show the item notes around the IC item screen, the OE order entry detail screen, and the OE order entry F9 or detail zoom screen. After downloading and installing Information Manager, you would go to Administrative Services, Data Activation, and activate the module within the company or companies that you want to use Information Manager Notes. Notes is one of the 5 submodules within Information Manager, and based on your license in Information Manager, you are able to access more or less of the icons. To check your license, you would go to the Information Manager license screen, and that will show you which modules you have an activation code for. In this case, I am only entitled to run Notes. I therefore cannot run the report runner screens, the optional table screens, the data view screens, or the document management link screens. The options available for notes are in the Note Setup menu, and they refer to the note types, roles, and user roles. But it is easier to use the visual process flow that we have set up for the Information Manager Notes configuration. In order to use the visual process flow, you would go to Admin Services, assign Visual Process Flows, and for the users that you want to be able to set up Information Manager Notes, you would activate that particular visual process flow. And now I have the IM Notes visual process flow, which I can use for my setup. So the options that are available for you if you have a Notes license are the Notes categories, which are the colors, the note types, the note roles, the user roles, the setup in the setup options, notes or document link hotkey setup, and the screens to enter notes if you want to enter the notes from the data entry screen. We're going to be setting up notes for items, and we want to show those notes around the IC item screen, the OE order entry detail screen, and the OE order entry F9 detail zoom screen. The first thing about notes is you can predefine colors or categories for the notes. So for our item notes, we first need to go and define the color that we want to use for our item notes. And that is done in the IM options on the Notes category tab. Here we can insert as many categories as we want. And I'm going to create one for items and then associate a color with that particular category. We would recommend that you use lighter shades of the colors, as if you use too dark a shade for the colors, you will find that it's hard to read the text on top. So I'm just going to use a pale blue for my item notes. The next thing you need is a note type. You can define as many note types as you want. So we're going to call this one item notes. When you create a note type, you can define whether you want to allow multiple notes for the same key. For example, you want to have more than one note for your items. And if you say yes, then as you add a new note or amend an existing note, the notes will keep track of date and time when the note was created and who last amended it. And you would associate your note with the default category or color. The situation where you might want to not allow multiple notes is, for example, if you had notes associated with your order entry shipments and you only wanted to keep one note about the shipment instruction, you didn't want to keep multiple notes. That might be a case of saying, no, I only allow one note. Once you've created your note type, you need to have roles. So roles controls the access to the note types. So I would always recommend creating an administrator role, and this role is typically give full access, and this is used for testing. But you might want to have an accounts role, and you would need to decide, do accounts have access to your item notes? In my case, I'm going to say no. I'm going to have a purchasers role, and perhaps the purchasers can add and view and edit the item notes, but they're not able to delete them. And finally, we're going to have a sales role, and perhaps the sales role can only view the item notes. And having created your roles, you need to assign your users to your role. I've only got one user in the system, admin, and I'm going to assign that to administrator. So having defined your note types, note roles, and user roles, you're now in a position where you can define which screens and which data values are going to trigger the notes to show. So it's best first to go and look at the screen where you want the information to show and take a note of the field labels and the screen IDs. So the first configuration I want to do is to show my item notes against my IC item screen and against the field label item number. And in order to assist me in working out what is the screen ID and what is the label, I can use my tray icon, the options, to show me that information. So when you're running Information Manager notes, initially the tray icon will be in your system tray. It is this yellow icon here. But for ease of setup and configuration, it is easier to drag that into your system tray so it's always visible and you don't have to click this up arrow to see it each time. And now if I right-hand mouse button and go to Options of my tray and drag that beside the screen that I'm interested in, and when I make the screen active by clicking in the screen that I want and in the field that I want, you can see that the roto ID of the screen is shown here, IC1110, and the field label of the active field is shown here, item number. And those are the two things I need to know when I configure my notes to show around my IC items. So back in the visual process flow, I use that information in my Notes options on the Notes and Document Management Link hotkey tab. And it's on this tab that you can configure the system to automatically start that tray icon for all users. And because it's been set to yes, that is why that tray icon was, although it was in my system tray, it was running when I went to the system tray. If I had set it to no, then either the users need to manually start the tray icon by every morning starting this tray icon, or you can create a startup folder. So you would create a folder on your desktop called Startup, and you would drag that tray icon into the startup folder. You might want to do it that way if you only want notes to run for a handful of users, not for all users. But in the case that I'm demonstrating here, where I want the notes to run for all users, the easiest configuration to do is just to say automatically start the Notes Document Management Link tray, set it to yes, and then as people connect to the Sage 300 company, the tray will start automatically. And it's in this grid that we do the configuration of the screens and field labels. It's easier to work in the detail zoom of this screen. So when you're configuring in the Options Notes DML hotkey tab, you can configure 5 different things to show in your alert box. It could be an info set, which comes with our module optional tables and allows you to display structured data in the note. And if you refer to the optional tables training video, you can see how that module works. We're going to configure for a note, but just to cover off these other options, if you're using SharePoint or Network folder, then you'd be using our Document Management Link module, which enables you to configure a list of documents stored in SharePoint or on a network folder to appear in the alert box. Or if you're using Extender and Notes, you can use Extender to display a conditional note. But in our case, we're working just with straightforward notes. The roto ID is the screen ID that you want to show the notes beside. And in our case, it was IC1110. If I was to leave the roto ID blank, then the notes would show on any screen which had the field label that I key in here. And the field label was item number. And this field label needs to be exactly the same as it is on the screen in terms of spaces and punctuation. And the only difference is here it can be all uppercase. You don't need to be case sensitive. And we're wanting to link the note to the item number field. If you're wanting to link the note to more than one field at the same time on the screen, you would fill in the second field label, and we'll come to an example of that later. Then you select the note type, And you would choose whether you want to show the first note, the last note, or all notes. So I had configured item notes to have more than one note, and I want to show all the notes at the same time. You can alert users that their notes in one of two ways. Either this tray icon can go red, or can go red and start flashing, or that tray icon can force the data entry up for you to type in a new note or amend an existing note each time. Or if you want to work with the Information Manager alert box, you would say no for the notification method, and in the alert box option, you would say whether you want to show the alert and fade out after a few seconds, or just show the alert. And in my case, I want to show the alert and see the note all the time. And you can optionally give a heading to the notes as well. So these are my item notes. So having created that configuration row and saved in your options, you need to refresh the tray icon. The reason why you need to refresh the tray icon is these settings are normally read as you open the company, and we don't go back to the options each time to refresh the settings, as it's a waste of system resources. But if you do change them after you've logged into the company, then you need to right-hand mouse button on your tray icon and select refresh. You'll notice the tray icon is now grey and will become yellow again when it is active. So if I go to my IC items screen now, you will notice that we've now got a yellow box here, which we didn't have previously. So this is showing us that notes is configured around the screen, but that we don't have any notes yet. Even when I select an item, we can see the yellow box indicating notes is configured, but we don't have any notes yet. Now to add a new note, we can click on this yellow note box and it will force the alert box up, and we can select new item note and add a note for the item. Because I configured the item notes to have multiple records for each key value, I can have as many notes as I want, and as I enter or amend a note, it keeps track of the date and time the note was created and the user created it, and the date and time the note was last amended. To refresh the note, I can just forward arrow, backward arrow, move on and move off the existing item. Or I could have closed the alert box and clicked on the note box again. But now you see for this particular item, we've got little purple squiggly lines for notes, indicating that we do have notes for this particular item. And you can see it has been colored light blue, which was the category I assigned to my item note type. When running the tray icon, if you want the logged on user to be using the currently used LAN pack, you need to go to the license information, current users, IAPs, and ensure that this option is deselected. This is by default selected for all version installations and often reselected with product updates. So you need to ensure that this workstation uses integration access pack licenses for external applications is always turned off for Notes users. And this is a user by user, workstation by workstation setting. We also want to display those item notes in the order entry screen, both on the F9 detail zoom and when the item is visible in the order entry detail grid. So when we see the item number in the detail grid, we want those notes to appear, and when we go to the item tax or zoom screen, we want those notes to appear. So using our options, using our notes options, we can check what is the active screen and what is the active field name. Now, because the field label is read-only here, I would have to insert a row and then click in the field, and I can see it's OE1100 and the field label is item number. Unfortunately, our options can't tell us the active field in a grid, but we can see the field label is item NO full stop / MISC full stop charge. So those are the two configuration rows I need to create for the OE1100 screen. So back in our options on the DML and Notes hotkey tab, we would insert two new rows here. So the first field label was item no / MISC charge, and the other configuration options would be the same. And we would save and refresh our tray icon. And going back to our order entry details to check, we can see because the A11030 is the active row, we are seeing the notes. If we click onto the A1050, we are seeing that there are no notes. And when we go to the item zoom or the item tax detail zoom screen, we would see there's no notes for the A1050, but going back to the original A11030, we are seeing a note. And we could add a note here. So I'm adding a second note for my A11030. Or if I wanted to add a note for my A11050, we would do the same. And now we see we have two notes for the first item and one note for the second item. We have just seen creating notes against and showing them against IC items in the OE order entry detail and the OE order entry F9 zoom. Now we're going to create another master file note for vendors, and we're going to display these notes in the alert box, and we're going to display them on the AP vendor screen, the AP vendor activity screen, and the PO order entry. First, in note categories, we created a category for vendors, a pale green color. Then in note types, we created our vendor notes, and we allowed multiple notes for the same key and associated it with our vendor's default category. Then in note roles, we assigned administrators full rights. To our purchasers role, we allowed to add, view, edit our vendor notes. And our sales role has no access to the vendor's notes at all. We want to display our vendor notes on AP vendors and AP vendor activity. And if we use our tray icon, we can see the vendor screen is the AP1200 and the field label is vendor number. And for our AP vendor activity, the roto ID is AP1500 and field label is vendor no full stop. And for our purchase order entry, we can see that the roto ID is PO1210 and the field name is vendor number. In the Notes DML hotkey setup in IM options, we need to have two configuration rows, one for vendor no full stop and one for vendor number. As we've not filled in a roto ID, this configuration row will show our vendor notes for all screens where it sees the field label vendor no full stop, for example, on our AP vendor activity. And this configuration row will show our vendor notes for all screens where it sees the field label vendor number, for example, AP vendors and PO order entry. And we also see vendor number on PO receipt entry and PO invoice entry, so we will see these notes on all those screens just for the single entry here. Refresh our tray icon and test. In AP vendors, we see the yellow note box with no purple lines indicating notes is configured on the screen, but no notes yet. And if we want to add a note for vendor 1200, we can click on this note icon. Select New Vendor Notes and add our note. And testing in vendor activity, and we see that same note. Similarly in purchase orders. When creating notes, if you've configured your note type to allow multiple notes per key value, then you can have as many notes as you want. Your notes can be as long as you want and can contain pictures and can contain hyperlinks to other documents. You can also copy your notes from a rich text format editor, for example Word, and paste that into your notes if you do require fancy formatting. Your note can be as long as you want. For hyperlinks in the note, we can always click on the hyperlink and the default program will open for that particular hyperlink. Notes can also contain pictures, which can be copied and pasted from the appropriate picture editor. These notes are stored in the database, so it is not recommended to do many very large pictures. If you want a list of large pictures, it is better to use our document management link product, which displays linked documents and doesn't store them in the database. The Notes Alert box can either be pinned to the Sage 300 screen, and in which case it moves with the Sage 300 screen, and when you minimize the Sage 300 screen and reopen, the note box will be attached to it, or it can be unpinned if you want to have the Sage 300 screen on one screen and the notes on a second screen. We have seen master file notes around vendors on the AP vendors, AP vendor activity, and PO order entry. Now we're going to set up a third note type, and this note type is to store notes against a combination of a vendor and an item note. So some specific note that you only see when you see the particular vendor 1200 and item A11030. And we want to see those notes in the alert box, and we want to see them on the purchase order detail grid, the purchase receipt detail grid, and the purchase invoice detail grid. For our vendor item notes, first we set up a category, a lime green color. Then we created our note type as allow multiple notes for the same key, and we associated it with our vendor item category. And then we assigned our roles. So the sales roles can view the vendor item notes. Purchasers roles can add, view, edit the vendor item notes. The administrators have full access, and accounts have no access at all. For our item vendor notes, we want to show the notes around the PO purchase order entry, the PO receipt entry, and the PO invoice entry. And using our tray icon, we can see the PO purchase order entry screen is PO 1210, and the field labels are vendor number and item number. For our purchase receipt, it is PO 1310, and the fields are again vendor number and item number. And for our PO invoice, it is PO 1400, and the field labels are vendor number and item number. So this is a case where if we don't use the Roto ID and we just configure for vendor number and item number, we will only need one configuration row for all these three screens. Back in the Notes DML hotkey setup, we would add a new row for the vendor item notes, leaving the Roto ID blank, so the single row will work for all three of the screens that we're configuring for. Field label 1 is vendor number, and field label 2 is item number. When it's possible that you may have a conflict between the same field label being both on the header and in the grid of the screen at the same time, you can also use the G and F notation to indicate whether you're talking about a header field or a grid field. So if I want to be absolutely specific, I could say F dot for the vendor number and G dot for the item number. I don't really need it for the vendor number, but for the item number, if I didn't want the notes to show on the F9 zoom, and I only wanted them to show on the grid, then I would say only when you see the vendor number and the item number in a grid, then show the vendor item notes. Show all the notes, show in the alert box, and perhaps these are our label specific instructions. Save in Options and refresh the tray icon, and then test. So we have the yellow icon showing us notes are configured for this screen, but no notes yet. So we'll enter a new PO for vendor 1200, and we see the vendor notes appearing. And when we go to the grid, now when we click on New, we can either enter new vendor item notes or just vendor notes. So I'm going to select vendor item, and you'll see the key to this particular note is 1200 for the vendor dash and then A11030 for the item. And record our note accordingly. Insert another item, add a new note for that item, post our PO, and when we select the appropriate PO where the vendor and item are active at the same time, we see now the label-specific instructions for the vendor and item, and we see the vendor notes. Now, had we wanted the vendor notes to appear first, and then the vendor item notes down below, we can use the display order in the Notes and DML hotkey setup to control which order we want to see the notes in. So on the Notes DML hotkey tray, at the moment my display order has just been 0 because I've only really had one note type on each screen. It hasn't mattered. But if I wanted to see my vendor notes first and then my vendor item notes second or third, what you could do is use the display order, refresh your tray icon, and back in our purchase order entry, and we see the vendor notes first, these green ones with our picture, and the vendor item ones last. And checking in the PO receipt entry as well, a receipt for vendor 1200 A11030 as our item. We're seeing the same vendor notes and vendor item notes, and the equivalent invoice entry screen too. We've just seen a combination of master file notes for vendors and items, and we saw them configured and saw them to be displayed in the alert box for purchase ordered details, purchase receipt details, and purchase invoice details. The next set of notes we're going to configure is around transactions. First, we're going to configure GL journal entry and display the note in the system tray. And then we're going to configure notes for OE shipment entry and display the note in the alert box. For our GL journal notes, we have gone into notes categories and added a new category for our GL journals, this light pink. Then in note types, we created a GL journal note type. And for this particular note type, we've said no, do not allow multiple notes for the same key. So we'll get one entry only. And we've associated it with the GL Journal's note default category. In our roles, we have assigned the accounts role to add, view, edit, and delete our GL Journal notes, and our administrators have full access too. But both purchasers and sales have no access to the GL Journal's notes. And using the Information Manager hotkey options beside the GL Journal entry screen, we can see that the fields that we want to configure against are the batch number and entry number on the GL 2100. For our GL journal notes, in the Notes DML hotkey setup, we are going to add a new row for a note associated with the GL 2100 screen, and the first field label to control the note is the batch number, the second field label to control the note is the entry number, and it's associated with the note type GL journals. Whether we say all notes, first note or last note here makes no difference because we configured GL journals to have only one record for the key. And under the notification method, we're going to select blink the tray icon. This will make the tray icon down here go red and flash when there is a note. We could also just make it go red, and we could make these data entry screen automatically pop up to amend or add a new note each time. We're not going to show it by default in the alert box, and when the alert box is open, the heading is going to be batch and entry notes. Save our options, refresh our tray icon, and test. In our GL journal entry screen, we have the yellow note icon now showing us that notes are configured for the screen, but no notes yet. If we were to go ahead and insert a new note, we note that the key is the batch number 207 and the entry number 1. And now that we have a note for batch 207, entry number 1, you can see our tray icon is gone red and is flashing. If we do want to see that note, we can either click on this tray icon to pop up the note, or hit the function key F11, which is the configured hotkey to open up the notes. To see which is the configured hotkey or to amend it, you can go to the options and reset or check the hotkey value. Here it's currently set to function key F11, but it can be reset by clicking here and selecting a different function key. And the second set of transactional notes we're going to create are for OE shipments. First, in note categories, we've created a category for the OE shipments. In note types, we created a note type for the OE shipments and said yes to allow multiple notes for the same key, and associated it with our default OE shipment category. And in our roles, we have said the sales roles can add, view, edit the OE shipment notes. The purchasers role have no access, administrators have full access, and the accounts role has no access. Using our tray icon and placing it beside the open OE shipment entry screen, and when we click in the shipment number field, the field that we want to associate the notes with, we see the field label is shipment number, and we see the roto ID is OE2200. And in the Notes DML hotkey setup, we add a new configuration row for notes to show on the OE2200 screen. The shipment number field label is the field label to trigger the notes. The note type is OE shipments. We want to display all the notes, and the notification method is none because we want to show it in the alert with the label of shipment labels. Save and refresh the tray icon. And to test our shipment notes, we launch the shipment entry screen, and we see the yellow note icon showing that notes have now been configured against this screen, but no notes yet. And even when we select a shipment, no notes yet. But to add a new shipment note, we click on the notes icon, go new OE shipment notes, add a note, and when the note is refreshed, we get our shipment note in the configured orange category or color. We've just seen how to configure transaction notes around the GL journal entry and the OE shipment entry. And with our GL journal entry notes, we displayed in the fact the notes exist in the system tray by making the tray icon go red and blink, whereas the OE shipment entry notes we displayed in the alert box. We're now going to configure notes around screens themselves. So not necessarily a data value in the screen, but the actual screen itself. So around our GL Journal entry screens, we're going to configure procedural notes to display in the alert box. And around our AR customer entry screen, we're going to display a note in the alert box to do with the customer entry screen itself. For our procedural notes, in Notes categories, we've created a category for instructions, and it is this purple color. In our note types, we created the instructions note type with only a single note for the same key and associated it with the default category instructions. And in our note roles, we have allowed the accounts role to add, view, edit, and delete our instructions. Administrators have full access as well. Purchasers can view the instructions only, and sales can view the instructions only. And in our Notes DML hotkey setup, we would specify the configuration row for the procedural notes. For procedural notes, this is the one case where you do not fill in the field label for the value. You fill in the actual roto ID. And to indicate to the system that it's the data that's going to be stored for the note key is the actual roto ID, we use these curly brackets or braces around the field label roto ID. And this tells the system to look for a screen or procedural note which is keyed by the actual value of the roto ID. And we've associated it with our note type, shown the alert, and the heading is procedural instructions. After creating the configuration row, we would refresh our tray icon. The first screen we want procedural notes for is the GL Journal entry. We notice that we have the yellow box, and when we click New, we can now either enter new roto ID or instructions for this screen or do the batch entry notes that we configured earlier. So selecting our instructions, when the screen opens up, it doesn't open up with the grid because we configured our instructions to have a single note. Reopening the note will show the purple instructions. You must use a specific user ID to post to prior period. And similarly for our AR customers, we can click on the icon to add a new procedural note for our AR customers. And with that single configuration row, we will get this new icon, this notes icon on all screens now, and we can add notes where needed. So we've seen how to configure procedural notes around entry screens. So far, all the setup we've been doing in the Options Notes DML hotkey tab is configuration for all users. But you can use the Transactions Note User options to override these configuration settings in the setup area and do user-specific configuration. All the configuration rows in the IM options refer to all users, as does the Start Tray icon when you log in. But user by user, and this is a user by user setting, you can go to the IM transactions, and for an individual user, you could select this option to use the settings below and override what's in options. So when you first select it, you get the default settings that are in options, but you could then come and amend any of these settings. You could either change the way you're alerted, use the system tray instead of the alert box, or you could even delete some of these rows and not see those configurations, or you could have completely new configurations for this specific user. A thing to note is, once you've selected this option, if you go back to your setup options and do system-wide changes, this user will not see those changes unless they come and reselect this option here. We also have an option in IM Transactions to add, edit, or delete the notes depending on your user profiles or your user roles. So here, although we've been adding new notes and viewing the notes through the original source entry, you can also add, view, edit, or delete notes here. So the note type is as per the note type that you set up, and the key is the key value to that particular note. So in the case of GL journals, we're seeing the journal batch and entry number because we configured to 2 field labels at the same time. But for instructions, you would see the instruction associated with the roto ID. And for vendor notes, we would see the vendor ID as the key. Notes can be imported from here, but due to the rich text formatting and the multiple record structure of the notes, it is better to use the Excel template that we have created, which you'll find in our knowledge base. And this assists you in importing notes with rich text formatting. We have seen the setup of notes in the Setup Options Notes DML hotkey tab, and this is for all users. And then using the Transactions Notes user options, you can override these settings user by user. For more information on notes, if you go to our website, orchid.systems, and select Notes from the product, the menu for our modules by product, you can see fact sheets, associated blogs, the brochure, product positioning video, about 15-minute product positioning video, and a approximately 40-minute product demonstration video. And now I'm just going to check if there's any questions during this training presentation. So I see the first question is, what is the difference between Sage 300 Notes and Orchid Notes? So Sage 300 Notes can be created, notes can be created for vendors, customers, and items. And when created, these notes show all the time. Whereas with Orchid Notes, you can create notes against vendors, customers, and items, but you can also do any other master file that you need notes around. For examples, locations, salespeople, general ledger accounts. You can also do notes against transactions. So you could have notes against your GL journals, against your order entry shipments, your invoices, and you can also do combinations of master files or combinations of master file and transaction. For example, notes against an AP invoice for a particular vendor. And in Orchid Notes, you can also configure which screens you want to see the notes for. So if you want to see the notes only on the OE shipment screen, then you can restrict the notes to only show on that screen. Or you could say show on any screen when you see the shipment number. Another question is relating to the use of the notes user options for individual users. So the question is, if you have to log on as the user to configure which notes they see, and how do you restrict them from modifying it? So at this stage, there is no way of controlling what users do to their own options if they use that particular icon. But what we're looking to do in a future release is to provide profiles for users and then have modified settings by profile, and then only some users will have access to those profiles, and users will be assigned to profiles for profile specific notes configurations. Another question regarding the field label, and the question is, if there is an asterisk at the end of the field, do we need to add that into the field label too? So yes, that's a good question. As you know, in Sage 300 screens, if the field is mandatory, they add an asterisk to the field label. With Orchid Notes, you can elect to configure with the asterisk or not with the asterisk. So if you did want to have a different note when it's a new vendor on the AP vendor screen, when it's saying vendor number asterisk, and then when it switches to when the vendor number is entered and it switches, the field label switches to vendor number without the asterisk because the mandatory field has now been filled in, then you can do a configuration row for vendor number asterisk and a second configuration row for vendor number. But if you do it that way, then Notes will assume that for all screens and fields, you are going to have two configurations, one with the asterisks and one without the asterisks, even if they point to the same note type. So if you do need to specify the difference, you can. Otherwise, we'd recommend just leave the asterisks out and notes would treat the field the same. I don't see any other questions on the notes, so thank you very much for watching this video. And if you do have any questions, please contact us on info@orchid.systems.